Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott. In the fall of 2024, Viltrox released their first of the Lab series of lenses, the AF 135mm F1.8 Lab FE for Sony. Fast forward 6 months and we now have the first Z-mount Lab series lens, and while this is the same 135mm F1.8, there are some different tweaks to the performance on Nikon, and they fall into both the good and bad categories. In today's review, we're going to explore how well this amazing lens performs on my Nikon Z8 body. We'll dive into it right after a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Fantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Fantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.fantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So let's start by talking about the build and handling. Now, as I've mentioned, this is the same lens that we've already seen on Sony FE, but obviously there has to be at least one significant tweak for it to work on Nikon Z mount and its much larger diameter mount. So you can see from this shot that there is actually a much wider area in the first part of the barrel before it tapers out to become wider. Now, obviously that's not going to affect the overall diameter because it's far from being the widest point in it, but it does add a few grams, as we're going to see in a moment. Now, on Nikon, obviously the really only chief competitor for this lens, maybe the only true competitor, is going to be Nikon's own 135mm f1.8 S-line Plena lens. So the lab lens is a little bit narrower in diameter, but actually also a little bit longer than what the Plena is. However, if you calculate the volume inside the lenses, the Plena is actually just a little bit bigger, right under 1%, so statistically insignificant. This lens is 93mm in diameter. That remains unchanged. That's 3.66 inches. It is about a millimeter and a portion longer in Z mount. So it's 147.6 millimeters or 5.74 inches. It has that 82mm front filter thread, which is pretty common with 135mm f1.8 lenses. Now, it actually, as noted, it does weigh in a little bit heavier than the Sony E-mount. It's 1,268 grams for this one, so plus between 20 and 30 grams. So that's 44.72 ounces. Now, while it is a little bit smaller in volume, a tiny bit, than the Plena, it actually is heavier. It's actually a plus 270 grams relative to the Plena being right under a kilo, and this, of course, being about 1.25 kilos. And so that is a significant amount of additional weight. Though, in this case, I also find that the lens itself, in terms of that mass, is a better fit on a heftier body like my Z8, as opposed to any of Sony's bodies, which tend to be a little bit smaller and lighter and with less significant a grip on it. So I don't know if two wrongs make a right here, but in this case, I do think it's a more natural fit here, at least if you're using one of the larger Nikon bodies. Now, in many ways, the Lab series, I think, is pretty akin to what Nikon's own philosophy has been with their f1.2 S-line lenses on Z-mount, in that they aren't small lenses, they're large, they're heavy, but they're optically incredible. And that really is the same kind of philosophy that Nikon is using on its Lab series. And in that way, I think that the Lab series is maybe more akin to the S-line f1.2 lenses than even Sony's own G-Master lenses, because Sony really has been prioritizing smaller and lighter as a part of their philosophy. And that's clearly not the case here. Now, aperture here is a little bit unconventional. Yes, it does play out similar to what we saw on Sony, but what you've got, rather than having a typical aperture ring with marked positions, you have something I think that is a little bit more similar to Nikon's command dial, that it is there, it has unmarked positions, and it's going to rely on this top-mounted LCD screen to display that information. Now, you do have the option to either click or declick that aperture. However, if you are using regarding the clicks, while it shows 1/3 marks on the LCD screen, and obviously also like on my Z8, it has a top mounted LCD screen itself. So you're going to see just the 1/3 stop, typical movements along there. However, there is actually a few more clicks than that. It's closer to being like 1/9 stop clicks. Really, the automatic position is not needed because you have that option to shift into it right from the camera body whenever you want. So a little bit, I actually prefer their more traditional approach that they use on their Pro Series lenses to what they have here on the Lab, but obviously the LCD screen does come into use for some other things as well, and that includes with the manual focus ring, and you can manually focus and you're going to get your distance scale on here. That of course is a positive addition because a lot of mirrorless lenses don't have any kind of distance scale, and so getting that, I do consider that to be useful. And then finally the LCD also comes into play in you have the ability to set an A and B focus position. And so the way to get to that is easily you set your A focus position and you're going to hold down the side function button until it registers as your A position. Then you can shift over and focus to whatever you want your B position to be. Again, hold that down. And now when you click that button, it will cycle between those two focus positions, going back and forth in A-B focus. And again, you're going to be able to utilize the LCD screen to help you to register that. Now, the other function button on the top is going to function in the traditional fashion, and it's going to do whatever value you've assigned from the camera body, and that function is going to be accessed there. Manual focus here, the weight it's about medium light, on the lighter side of medium, so that in itself is not bad. However, what I do find is that on Sony, it felt like focus moved a little more linear. And by linear, I don't mean whatever that complete degree of focus arc would be, but more that it just seems more like true manual focus, that as you move along, you're just gradually moving focus, not moving it in steps. Here on Nikon, it feels a little more steppy to me. And so particularly if you're trying to be precise, it feels like focus just moves in small chunks rather than just that smooth linear fashion. So I actually don't like the manual focus quite as well here on Nikon. Now, besides the click, declick switch that's on the left side, you have two other switches. And so one of those is going to be the focus limiter, and so that focus limiter is gives you 3 different positions. You can do the full range, you can do 70 centimeters up to 2 meters, and then from 1.5 meters to infinity. And so obviously in certain situations that might help you from racking focus in the wrong direction or just speeding up focus just a little bit if you're wanting to target a certain zone. There's also an AF/MF switch here on the body. All of that is always welcome, gives you more direct control over the actual lens itself. Now, one other thing about the LED is that in its startup kind of splash animation, you can actually program, right now it says Viltrox, it shows the Viltrox logo. When you actually boot up the lens itself or you power on the camera, you can customize that splash screen, and so it has your name or your own company's logo, whatever the case may be, or whatever else you want it to say when it powers up, and that can be set through the Viltrox app. Now, the body itself, part of the reason why this is such a kind of heavy lens is that it's an extremely well-made lens. It has a magnesium alloy shell, so that's the same kind of material, for example, that's going to be used in this Z8 body, and so it's a very tough, very durable, so that's great, obviously. There is thorough weather sealing throughout the lens. That starts with the gasket at the lens mount. There are 12 seal points all throughout the lens itself, and then a flooring coating on the front element. So this is a professional grade lens, and it does come with a professional grade build. It does have Viltrox trademark USB-C port on the lens mount, a secondary way to do firmware updates, though also you can use Bluetooth and use the app for firmware updates as well. There is no image stabilization built into the lens itself, so it will rely on in-camera stabilization if your camera is so equipped. And as is often the case, I find with third-party lenses, it does feel a little more stable to me on my Z8 than what it did on either one of my Sony bodies, so I appreciate that. Now, one of the things that will throw people who are not familiar with this kind of design is that when you actually rock the lens up and down when it is powered off, you will hear a bit of a clunking sound. There are floating elements inside, which by the way is not uncommon in higher end lenses. And the reason for those floating elements is it does allow for a better performance up close. Now, what you will find is that you can have the lens mounted and you can do that rocking motion and you'll hear that clunking. But if you turn the camera on and so those elements become energized, that clunking is going to go away. So you don't have to be concerned about it. That is an intentional part of the design and it does have a purpose. It improves performance. Now, speaking of that close focus abilities, this lens can focus down to 72 centimeters and there it achieves a 0.25 times level of magnification. So that's a 1 to 4 magnification level, which is extremely useful. And by the way, it does best the Plena. The Plena has a 0.20 times magnification or a 1 to 5 magnification ratio. And so again, welcome to have that. And its up close performance is fantastic. It's incredibly sharp and frankly, you could throw an extension tube on there and it would be a fantastic macro lens because it does have such high resolving capabilities. It does come with a very nice lens hood. You can tell that, again, this is a premium lens hood. The materials on it feel very premium. It has kind of a light flocked finish that matches the lens itself. It does have that rubberized front surface, and so you can actually set, heavier lenses are sometimes nice to just set face down, for example, like this. And so, it's a stable way because the lens hood is wider. It's a stable way to kind of put the whole system down. And so it does have that rubberized. And also I find the secondary purpose of that that's useful is that if you do bump into something with the front end of that, it absorbs a little bit more of the shock. It does come with a pouch as well that's kind of like Canon's L series pouches. Not as nice as a zipped padded case, but useful. One other thing I will point out is that lens hood is designed, it's fairly small compared to some of the other lenses, and it's also designed to where it can reverse fairly tightly, and so it takes up less room for storage. One thing I do note is that because you have that rubberized surface here, and you're going over a rubberized manual focus ring, and it's close fitting, sometimes it will kind of hang a little bit on there. There's a little bit of friction between those rubberized surfaces. Not a big deal, but just something to be aware of. Overall, this is a beautifully built lens, obviously very feature rich, but it is big and heavy. However, the Plena is also big and heavy, and I would say the advantage of the Viltrox lens is that its price tag is probably going to be near the Sony's. It hasn't been announced at this point, but I'm assuming it's going to be close. The Sony came to market with an MSRP of $899 US. Right now, the Plena costs $2,499 US, so $900 versus $2,500. Obviously, that is going to make this a very interesting proposition if the rest of the performance holds up. Spoiler alert, it does. So let's talk autofocus. This lens employs a first for Viltrox. It was really technically first in the Sony version, but first in this lens itself, in that we have a dual, not just one focus motor, but dual hyper VCM focus motors that work in pair with each other. And so, by the way, that's the same kind of focus system that we have in the Plena, where, with two of these high thrust motors working in conjunction with each other. That allows you to have very fast, very quiet, and also very accurate autofocus. And you can see here that in my formal focus test, I found that focus was good. It is a little bit slower than what I saw on Sony. And most of that is because you will see just kind of a little bit of a pulse there sometimes. So it feels just a little bit less confident. Now, when you're not doing major focus racks, kind of real world focus, I actually didn't notice that happening. And really the only time I had any kind of actual real world focus issues were in two very unique situations. One of those is, which is very, very common across a lot of platforms, and that is that sometimes when you're trying to focus on a close subject and the background's a little bit busier, focus wants to stay locked on the background and doesn't want to move to the foreground. So you have to kind of trick it. A lot of times I try to find a higher contrast area and get it in the focus zone, and then it locks on there, or you can manually focus and get yourself into the general zone, and then you can focus there. And on Nikon, it's easy to do full-time override at any point. And so not too big of a deal there. The other thing, which is very understandable, I actually shot a portrait series, which we'll go ahead and start to look at here. I went out and shot a portrait right during the middle of a blizzard, literally in the middle of a blizzard that dumped, over 1.5 feet of snow, and I think around 50 centimeters of snow we got during that storm. And so right in the middle of that, I went out and I shot a portrait session. Now, I love the results that we got, but there was constantly snow was falling. And so as a byproduct, when I was further away from my subject, there were occasions where it got kind of distracted by all the movement of the falling snow, and it would be kind of looking for focus there. Obviously, that's a very, very specific case scenario there. And what I did find is that when I moved a little bit closer to my portrait subject, that problem went away because the subject was closer, higher contrast, and thus focus locked on just fine. The other thing that I did notice as a positive, remember I noted that there are some good, some bad in the trade-off from Sony to Nikon here. Well, one of the huge pluses is that on a Nikon, there is no artificial limitation of burst speed for third-party lenses. So on Sony, even though my Alpha 1 could shoot 30 frames per second, I could only shoot a maximum of 15 frames per second on Sony, and that's true of all third-party lenses. In this case, or at least with autofocus, I should add as a caveat. On a Nikon, there is no such limitation, so I could shoot at the 20 frames per second with RAWs or up to the 30 frames per second shooting JPEGs, which I did, and you can see some of those shots. I shot squash. I've been playing a lot of squash recently. Squash this was a difficult lens to use for shooting squash, not because of any of the focus capabilities. It did great in that regard, but because you're shooting through glass and it's a long focal length, it meant that framing was sometimes really, really challenging, and so the shots aren't as optimal as what I would like, and you're also, of course, limited to one kind of particular angle of view out of the back side of the court where the glass is there rather than the solid walls. So it's a little bit of a hard sport to photograph anyway, and with a longer focal length, I think harder still. However, focus locked on, it stayed there, and even through 30 frame burst, or 30 frames per second burst, I should say, it stayed locked on. And someone that was sitting there by, they said, "How many pictures did you just take?" I said, I don't know. All I know is I was taking them at 30 frames, 30 shots for every second. And so anyway, it did a great job for that. And so once again, I tested the Sony version for shooting basketball. I had no problems tracking action. Focus is plenty fast enough to do that. So in general, I would say autofocus is excellent here. And for stills, I have no hesitations. It did a fantastic job. So how about autofocus for video? So first of all, doing my focus pulls, here I definitely saw some regression as compared to Sony. I'm going to give you one caveat in that I am actually reviewing final retail firmware. And so it is possible that results may get a little bit better once we have the final firmware, retail firmware that is released before the lens is actually sold to the general public. However, I can only test with what I can see right now. And what I found is that there's just a little bit less confidence, again, than what I saw on Sony. And so rather than just a confident, point A to point B and back, you can see that there's sometimes a little bit of a beginning of a pulse in the wrong direction, a little bit of a rack in the wrong direction. And that obviously does not only slow down the focus pulls, but it also makes them a little bit less cinematic in that regard. I also found that when approaching the camera, as you can see in this clip, that it really just wasn't as reactive as Sony to focus changes. It's okay if I was moving in a roughly linear fashion towards the camera, but if I stepped out of frame or I moved a little bit more abruptly towards the camera, it was just not as quick to react as what I saw on Sony. And so again, in general, focus not quite as confident in that regard. Now, if you're shooting something less extreme, obviously autofocus is going to be better, and so most of my real-world clips, they were better, and you can see here a few related to the portrait session. And again, because focus is just getting to a specific point and then holding that, maybe little minor adjustments as the model moves a bit, no problem. And so I think for most situations, you're going to be fine, but if you're trying to do bigger focus changes, it's not as cinematic as the performance I saw on Sony, so not quite as good. So how about the overall performance when it comes to the image quality? I'll give you an overview here on Nikon on the 45 megapixel Z8, and then there will be a deep dive at the end of the video if you want that. So as before, same optical design, 14 elements in 9 groups. That includes 4 extra low dispersion elements, 2 high refractive index elements. You can see that the MTF chart here looks exceptionally good. There's a little bit of drop off in the corners, but it's still at very strong levels. You can see when the lens is stopped down, it's basically perfect. It's a straight line across. That's as good as you're going to get. Now, just comparing MTF charts to MTF charts, you'll see that the Plena, the lab lens is actually sharper than the Plena lens according to their respective MTFs. I do hope to be able to do a Plena comparison at some point, but I'm still working at trying to source a Plena to do that. And so this is an amazingly sharp lens. And you can see here, if we take a look at a few just tight crops of some f1.8 shots, they are just brilliantly sharp here on Nikon as well. As before, there is no measurable distortion to see, but unlike on Sony, where I saw very little vignette, nothing really to correct, there is more noticeable vignette here on Nikon. Often the case, I find, when I am comparing one lens to another on the platform. If I test a lens on both platforms, it tends to have more vignette on Nikon. And so in this case, I needed a +50 to correct for the vignette, whereas on Sony, I basically didn't plug in anything to correct for vignette. What I also found is that, as I saw before, the fringing is amazingly well controlled on this. And so you can see both in this shot of text, here a Bible, and then also in shooting the surface of a lens. These are two scenarios where I tend to really see longitudinal style chromatic aberration, and there's basically nothing there. It seems very much like an apochromatic lens. In many ways, it reminds me of my Zeiss Milvus 135mm F2 in that regard. I did find the tiniest amount of lateral style chromatic aberration near the edge of the frame, but very little. You're probably not going to see anything in the real world. You can see here that the wide open sharpness is just amazing. And one thing I did find as a positive here on Nikon as opposed to Sony, maximum resolution here is 45 megapixels versus 61 that I tested on Sony. And what I found is that in the area where the lens would be the weakest, in the corners, that lower resolution level allows those corners to look a little bit better. And so I actually found that it was more consistent in terms of the sharpness across the frame. You can also see here in this slide where I compared the mid frame and the upper left corner that, I mean, there is a little bit of drop off, but they're both remarkably good. And so it's just really great. I also found with both my test charts and then also real world shots, the micro contrast on this lens is amazing. By micro contrast, I mean the ability to resolve the textures of very fine details. And so rather than there being any kind of haze or veiling around those textures, they just look super crisp. And so there's not only contrast looking at the image at large, but you see amazing contrast even looking at that micro level. Certainly the case here. You'll find that there is a slight improvement at f2.8 in terms of overall contrast and a little more detail. That's most noticeable in the corners. You'll see a little bit more at f4 and f5.6. And by that point, you have basically perfect image quality all across the frame, as we saw from that MTF when it stopped down. Landscape images look fantastic, of course, because there's so much detail and ability to resolve all those fine details. Amazing secondary applications if you're shooting a very large scene, to be able to use a telephoto lens and compress that scene a little bit and get a lot of those details. It's fantastic for that. It's obviously an amazing portrait lens. And it's not just because it's incredibly sharp. Sometimes an incredibly sharp lens is almost detrimental for portrait work. But I just find the portraits look great. From the skin tones look very good. Overall colors look fantastic. And this lens not only has amazing technical performance, it also has beautiful rendering. It's a very rare lens that can pull off both of those qualities working in tandem, but this Lab Series 135mm does. I found in general that the bokeh is really nice, very soft, very creamy. You can see specular highlights aren't like perfectly round in the corners. At f1.8, stop down a little bit, even f2.5, they are going to be perfect all across the frame. And but the biggest thing is that they're very smooth. There's no outlining in out-of-focus areas. I would argue that from what I've seen from Plena shots, that I would say that the Lab is every bit as good, if not better. And so we'll determine that when we do a direct comparison. But certainly the bokeh quality and the overall rendering is fantastic. As noted, their optical glass is now excellent, and so colors are just fabulous. Also, I found when testing the E-mount version, I haven't been able to do it here because we've literally been in the series of just terrible winter weather with one winter storm after another. But what I found when testing the E-mount version in better conditions is that also it was a nice astro lens as well with very low coma. The final thing that stood out to me is that flare resistance is really good for a lens with a huge front entrance pupil like this. Actually really excellent flare resistance, so the coatings are very good as well. So that leads me to my conclusion. This is a great combination of build, features, autofocus, and optical performance at a very, very great price. Again, you're looking at a lens that has no real measurable flaws other than it being big and heavy, but at a price of $900 versus $2,500 for the Plena, it's really going to make a lot of people, I think twice. And I think that this whole Lab series probably is going to have a pretty sweet little niche in Nikon Z mount, because it's going to, I suspect the series will allow you to get S-line performance and those really bright maximum apertures at a much, much lower price. And that's going to be amazing for people who the threshold for them is not the size and the weight of the lens, but it's the price of the lens. And so the Lab series does not make this smaller and lighter. In fact, goes a little bit the other direction, but it brings that price down into a place where it's going to be affordable for a lot more people. So yes, the lens is big and heavy, no question about it. But outside of that, there is very little to complain about. My conclusion, as it was on Sony, is that this is probably the best optics you're going to get for under $1,000. And I will say this, if you happen to own a Plena that you'd be willing to loan me to do the comparison, reach out to me in the comments below and we'll see if we can arrange that, because I am still trying to source one to do one of my deep dive head-to-head comparisons. And on that note, if you want more information about the Lab 135 Z mount, you can check out either my full text review linked in the description down below. There's an image gallery link there, buying links there. And now if you want my signature deep dive into the optics, stay tuned and let's jump in.
Okay, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. Now, as far as distortion goes, there might be a fraction of a percentage of pincushion distortion. Nothing worth correcting, frankly. Vignette, as noted, is a little bit heavier here on Nikon. Well, significantly heavier, considering that it was basically vignette free on Sony, and so we definitely do have some here now. This is a plus 50 to correct in the corners, and it shows you can get to a very neutral state once again. I will note that there is already a correction profile, and it will take care of that. Longitudinal style chromatic aberrations are essentially perfectly corrected, and you can see here before and after the plane of focus. It's just basically neutral, no fringing. This is a situation where I'd expect to see fringing here, and all of the embedded edges here of the engraved portions of the lens. You just don't see it anywhere. This is a magnificent, this really is an apochromatic-like performance here. With the lateral style chromatic aberrations, I saw nothing on Sony. I do see a little bit here on Nikon. So for whatever reason, it behaves just a little bit different in the corners of the frame. Nothing significant. It's all easily correctable, but there is some there that I didn't see on Sony. So here testing on a 45 megapixel Nikon Z8 body. This is at 200% magnification. In the center of the frame, you know, it's basically perfect, very high resolution. As we move towards the mid frame, I mean, if anything, it looks better to my eye. It's just really, really magnificently sharp. All of these little stamps, you can see the detail right off to the edge. Down to this point, you can see the New Zealand bill. It looks fantastic. And then right on down here to the edge, it's just really, really strong. And I think that lower resolution point allows the Nikon version, or maybe just the way that the Nikon sensor behaves, allows you to get a little bit better corner performance. This is really fantastic looking in all of those corners, and you can also see it's very well centered as well. I always think it's important to put those test chart results in context in a real world shot. So that's f1.8. Is that not just brilliantly sharp? I mean, all those fine details you can see here on Nala, just, you know, fantastic. Another shot here. I mean, that is just, look at how finely delineated all those little hairs are. I mean, that's just amazing. This shot really stands out because it shows the blend of the beautiful rendering, but then also the technical brilliance. You go in there and every little bit is just perfectly outlined. There's no bleeding, no soft edges. It looks just fantastic. And that means that you can shoot, you know, full body length, distant portraits here. And obviously I'm shooting through snow. And so that, you know, snow is going to soften things just a little bit, but even so you can see it's just brilliantly sharp. Contrast is amazing. The background is beautifully blurred out. Just awesome. Stopping down to f2 there on the right hand, you'll see that there actually is just a little bit more contrast to be had there. And so, I mean, if you want to do a very mild stop down, it does add just a little bit more punch. Those of you that are eagle-eyed may have noted that there is a glitch before the final firmware on the lens, where for whatever reason in Lightroom, it shows the lens designation properly, but it shows the focal length incorrectly at 16 millimeters. I've been assured by Viltrox that will get corrected in a firmware update. But you can see that, I mean, the amount of detail that is there is just amazing. From f2 to f2.8, you get just a little bit more, just a little crisper, a little darker contrast there. Down into the corners, you can see that the corners are looking just better still, more pop. By f4, these corners are just razor sharp. I mean, it's really, really fantastic. And if we look, for example, over here, you can just see how amazing that is, enough to where we're seeing that moire pattern on pretty much all the textures that might flow together. It's just ridiculously sharp. Now, even with a super sharp lens, diffraction is going to kick in, and so at f11, it's just mildly softer and then a little bit softer at f16. However, this lens is just so sharp that I could compare this result to, say, the new 50mm f1.4 Z-mount lens, and I can tell you this result is sharper even after diffraction than what that lens is at f2, and so it's ridiculously sharp. Now, those floating elements allow for a really amazing up-close performance. It's able to deliver all these fine details. It's just really, really special. And like I said, I think if you threw some extension tubes onto your lens, you could actually get macro performance pretty easily. And this lens is going to have no problem doing the actual resolving. Here is what it looks like with a chess piece at that minimum focus distance, maximum magnification, and you can see the detail is, obviously Plena focus is tiny, but where it is in focus, the detail is just fantastic, and you're able to really fill the frame with something quite small. I use this lens for one of my other reviews to do all the product shots because, as I said, I mean, it's delivering a macro-like performance, even if it can't deliver that level of magnification. So if you up that magnification a bit, you could get really brilliant results. Here's another shot. It's just a little further out from minimum focus distance, but again, it's holding such amazing detail and delivering a gorgeous end result. Now we can see wide open. There is a very mild amount of cat eye near the edge. It's still quite round, so not a big deal. You can stop down a bit and you'll get that rounder shape. There are 11 aperture blades in this design. Going to deliver a nice circular shape kind of throughout. In many cases, if you're up close, you're probably going to want to just stop the lens down, not because you need more sharpness, as we'll see for a moment when these textures pop in. It's brilliantly sharp. But here at f2.8, I've just shot that way just to increase the depth of field just a little bit. And as you can see, even at f2.8, it's really quite tiny, and the background is still completely obliterated. Colors, I think, are really, really nice from this lens, and it just stands out. It's that kind of rich and deep saturation because of having such good contrast. And so even if you're shooting landscape type images, you're going to get tons of fine detail everywhere on the frame and really, really nice looking color. And as noted, I really love this lens for portraits. Here you can see at f1.8, one of my favorite things about 135mm fast lenses is you can shoot full body portraits in environments and still just really blur out the background. And again, here shooting through the texture of the falling snow, you can see that the detail is still amazing. You move in a little bit closer, as I've done here, the background disappears and you can have that beautiful blend of background color. It's a little less the case here because everything is whited out. But I mean, the amount of detail that's there, skin tones and textures, contrast in the hair, all those things. It's a fantastic portrait lens. Finally, flare resistance is really good. Here is a wide open result, and you can see, again, there's no problems with flare, ghosting. Here in the corner, I could put it here. Again, there's no issues there. If I stop the lens down, again, no issues there. You can see very, very mild ghosting pattern here, but everything just holds up just fine. So you're going to get a really, really great end result all across every metric, basically, optically with this Lab Series lens. So as you can see, the Lab 135 f1.8 is an incredible optical performer, and really, I would say at this point at least, this is easily the sharpest lens that I've tested on Nikon Z-mount at this point. That's pretty high praise. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.